We're all familiar of the CNN heroes, di ba? Every year, CNN would people would nominate CNN Heroes of the Year. I was watching one time, and I was really, really blessed looking at this woman, an Indian woman in India, ministering and rescuing women who were abducted and sold for human trafficking. What an extraordinary courage, what an extraordinary service to humanity. And no wonder that woman was nominated as part of the CNN Heroes of the Year. And coming to our own context, we're also familiar of Efren Peña, Florida, who also received an award in CNN Heroes of the Year. And reading his account in the internet, Efren started with a burden of taking care of the poor, the underprivileged in the Philippines, the less fortunate children. And instead of bringing them to where he is to teach them, he came up with a strategy and a beautiful program of going where the children are and start bringing them education, books, and lessons. And he would teach them how to brush their teeth. He would teach them how to paint, and so on and so forth. And after many years, he was noticed by CNN, and he was given the CNN Heroes of the Year award. Again, I wonder in my heart, I said, what an extraordinary service to mankind. What an extraordinary passion and burden really to touch hearts of people regardless of return, to really make a difference in the world or in his community. Now let's get closer to where we are. Sometime July of, I think, 2 years ago, Singapore was surprised. We all read in the news that here's a Filipina woman who worked as a domestic helper in Singapore, came here more than 20 years ago. Maybe she landed in Changi Airport, not knowing what's at stake for her in working in Singapore. Maybe for her, she was just driven to come to Singapore for the need of her family or to give her family a brighter future. And she found herself working in a local employer. Second year, third year passed, 5 years passed, so fast, and it's really, really fast. The time really flies. After 10 years, and then 15 years, and then 20 years, she actually worked for more than 20 years with a particular employer. And the employer died. And we were all shocked reading at the newspaper in Straits Times that the employer awarded her, gave her an inheritance of 6 million Singapore dollar and a luxury apartment somewhere in Orchard Road. You remember that? You still remember the story? And we were all, I was just wondering if that sister is part of our church. And I really like what she said. She said, I am the luckiest maid in Singapore, with or without the money. Wow. Again, I wonder, what an extraordinary heart. She came to Singapore not knowing 20 years down the road that these things will happen. And yet her service was rewarded. Perhaps you're seated there right now and you also ask in your heart, what can I contribute or do? Can I really make a difference in this life? Somehow we wonder, how can I make a difference in this world or impact other people's lives or the people of the world for that matter? But I've noticed and I've learned that people who serve, people who really serve are not after people's attention or even to notice them. They just do what they are required to do, share and give what they have and what they can. The heroes that I mentioned, the sister or the Filipina that I mentioned a while ago, she did not come to Singapore expecting after 20 years that she will inherit that 6 million and a beautiful apartment in Orchard. She just did what she could to serve the Lord. Let me begin today, this Sunday, as the first Sunday of May in our series of Inspiring Service. Let me begin by leading you to a short story, a story of a woman who did an inspiring act of service and kindness, which wins a great reward both in the eyes of men and the eyes of God. I posted in the internet, in our Facebook, who is she? Di ba? Her name means gazelle. In those days, women are described after beautiful animals. Gazelle is a beautiful deer. In those days, they would describe somehow a characteristic of a woman by using an example of a beautiful animal. And one of the examples is this woman that I'll be talking with you today. Her name means gazelle, a gracious form of an animal. Maybe it reflects the graciousness of her life as she deals with people. Now, if you're taking notes, our conversation today is entitled Service Award. The sharing that I would like to bring you today, or the message that I want to share with you, is entitled Service Award. And you will notice that the name of the woman I'm talking about was Dorcas. How many of you are familiar of Dorcas, honestly speaking? Very few. I guess you have read it. You have read the story of Dorcas, but you missed out on her. Because she's not that famous. She's not that popular. But she made an inspiring story, an inspiring service that noticed the eyes of God and the eyes of men. Dorcas. She was also called Tabitha. Now, if there's one truth, if there's one lesson that I want to relate to you today, brothers, I want you to take home today. This is the one truth that I've seen when I was studying the story of Dorcas. Serving others wins a great reward. Let me qualify that. A true servant is just serving without wondering whether people notice them. So I'm coming from that premise na hindi tayo nagsiserve in order to win great reward. A true servant is a person that just share, and do what she can and what she could without really asking or trying to get the attention of our employers, of our leaders. A true servant serve with all our heart, trying to make a difference in the little way that we can. And the good thing about serving is that when we serve others, it will win a great reward. It may not be a material thing, but respect of people. Diba? Respect of our employers. Maybe you have been serving with your employers for more than 10 years now. And because of your quality service, you earn respect. And I think that's a great reward. If our employer will talk about us and say, you know, this servant of mine or this employee of mine, she's really good. He's honest. I think when we do quality service, a service from the heart that impacts people and the world, I think we win great reward, whether it's material or immaterial things. But we all know that the best of all is when God sees our hearts and He say, well done, my good and faithful servant. So serving others wins a great reward. Now, let me bring you to the story of Dorcas. The story of Dorcas happened during the ministry tour of Peter. Acts chapter 8, if you noticed, the persecution of Stephen. Acts chapter 9, in Acts chapter 8, Philip also was ministering to the Ethiopian eunuch. Acts chapter 9, Paul encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus. And then he persecuted the church. He was running and after the Christians. And along the way to Damascus, Jesus revealed himself to Paul, and Paul was converted. You remember the story? It is in chapter 9 that Peter again appeared in the story. It is in the midst of this persecution that dispersed all over Asia Minor because of Paul trying to persecute. Now, in Acts chapter 9, right after the persecution, there was this story that was inserted, and it's all about the tour, the ministry tour of Peter, because he was going around encouraging the believers. In Acts chapter 9, 32 to 35, in Lydda, according to Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, Peter went visiting the saints in the different parts of Asia Minor, visiting just to encourage them to continue no matter what the persecutions brought to them. So he went, and one of the place that he went, Peter, was Lydda. And in Lydda, according to the book of Acts chapter 2, chapter 9, 32 to 35, Peter found a man, a bedridden man for 8 years. He found this man named Aeneas. And here comes Peter. He was visiting the churches, trying to encourage them. He saw this man and encouraged this man, and he said, he healed him. You read that portion there. Peter just said, Jesus Christ heals you, Aeneas. And Aeneas stood up, and miraculously Aeneas was healed and got well. Luke tells us at the end of that verse, verse 35, that many turned to the Lord because of what happened, in spite of the persecution. Many turned to the Lord in spite of what happened. Now, just to give you this is the introduction. It's very important that we may understand this short passage as we jump to the story of Dorcas. But let me give you this map so that we will have an understanding of where's the location of the cities that we'll be talking today in our sharing of God's Word. You notice Jerusalem, 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem is actually Lydda. In those days, there were no MRTs, there were no taxis available, so people will walk or even ride camels or donkeys or horses. And another 10 miles northeast or northwest of Lydda is actually Joppa. Joppa we will talk about later on in the event of Dorcas. So this is very important. Please bear in mind, as I'm talking, I'm sharing with you the story of Dorcas. Remember this map so that we know where the locations of where we're discussing, okay? So verse 36, let's jump to verse 36 now. And here comes the story. Remember the healing of Aeneas? The whole Lydda found out, heard about the news. Now verse 36, here comes the story of an insertion of the story of this woman named Dorcas. In Joppa, okay, remember the map? Where's Joppa? Northwest of Lydda. Joppa, if you remember in your Old Testament, Joppa is where Jonah took his boat going to Tarshish instead of going to Nineveh. Remember the story of Jonah? So this port, this city of Joppa existed many years ago. And even today, when we look at the map, Joppa is a port city or a seaport, if we can call it. Now, interesting, in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, probably the Hebrew rendering of the name, which is translated Dorcas, which means gazelle, a beautiful deer. I really wonder, maybe Dorcas she's really beautiful. She's maybe the graciousness of this person was really reflecting her character. And one thing I've noticed there, before we jump to the next verse, she was actually one of the first women that was mentioned as a disciple. Very rare in the Bible that a woman is ascribed as a disciple. Followers of Christ, part of the church, okay. But to be singled out as a disciple, it means something to us. Many scholars believe that Dorcas was not just an ordinary member of the church. She is part actually of the deaconesses, or maybe she's part of the leaders of the church. One of those key leaders, Dorcas. And interesting the way Luke described her, Luke said, Dorcas, who was always doing good and helping the poor. It is not an accident why that word was placed there. It's not an occasional thing for Dorcas. It's not a seasonal thing for Dorcas. Doing good and doing charity work, serving other people was an 24/7 for her. Again, I wonder, an extraordinary heart to touch people's lives. Service. She was always doing good and helping the poor. Later on, we will find out what the poor in the Bible means. So Dorcas noticed, or she was touching people's lives. She was serving in the church by helping the poor, by making a difference to them. Now, as this woman was introduced to us, verse 37 tells us that about that time, what time? The healing of Aeneas. Maybe the same week that happened. The healing of the person in Lydda. Remember? That made a lot of conversions of people in Lydda. In spite of the persecution, they still believe in Jesus, the resurrected Jesus Christ. About that time, the Bible tells us, Dorcas died, became sick and died. And her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Now, coincidence? Or maybe God is actually about to do something. I don't know. We will see later on. About that time, she became sick and died. There is a procedure of embalming before a person is buried. But you will notice here, they just bathed the body of Dorcas and placed it in an upstairs room. Now, she was sick probably during that week when Peter was already visiting that area. And eventually, at the same time, she died. And in verse 38, Lydda was near Joppa. Remember the map? It's just 10 miles away. Lydda was near Joppa. So when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, remember the news reached even Joppa, that Aeneas was healed miraculously, that paralytic person for 8 years. So what the church did, the disciples, look at this, the disciples, who's Luke referring to? The leaders of the church. Maybe the key leaders. And here, mentioning Dorcas as the disciple. And here comes Luke again, having, when the disciples or the leaders of the church heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men and urged him, please come at once. I don't know how long it took them to go to Joppa, probably a day or half a day. And Peter went with them. Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken in the upstairs room. Remember where the body of Dorcas was laid after bathing the body? The people did not bury Dorcas. The people did not embalm her. They were expecting something when they invited Peter. Now, it's getting interesting. All the widows, when imagine Peter came, and I can imagine many people were following because Peter is the key disciples, remember? And remember Peter, there was a news that only the shadow of Peter, many people were healed. Remember those stories in the book of Acts? So people were expecting something big. Here comes Peter walking, and many people were following him. He was brought to the upstairs room, and when he entered that room, all the widows, now, these widows are the poor that we were talking about a while ago, always helping others and always doing good and helping others, or the poor. The poor are the widows, the orphans, and the beggars on those days. That's why if you read the Old Testament, God is always caring for the poor. When you mention poor in the Bible, it's either widow, because if you're a widow in those times, the word widow actually comes from the word you don't have a voice. Ang kultura nila nung panahon, dahil patriarchal po, more of the male kind of culture, ang isang babaeng nabalo ay wala hong boses sa society. There was no one who will earn for you. No one will work for you. So you will end up begging. No one will hire you. You don't have a voice. They would not pay attention to you. Remember the story of Ruth? That's why the Bible is very clear, even in the New Testament. When they were serving, that's why they selected deacons in Acts 7 to help the widows. Unahin sa pagkain ang mga widows. Dahil nung panahon, kagaya rin natin ngayon, pag may handaan, nag-uunahan sa pila, nag-aalit yung mga disciples. Paunahin yung mga widows. I can imagine na siyempre yung mga balo ng panahon, nahuhuli sila, nauubusan sila ng pagkain. All the widows stood around him, Peter, crying, wailing, mourning. Oh, Peter, maybe they were crying. And the good thing about here is showing him all the robes and clothing that Dorcas made while she was still with them. That's why I said Dorcas was good in her needle. May sewing kit si Dorcas. Maybe you have a drumstick to serve the Lord. Maybe you can play a guitar. But Dorcas, she had a sewing kit. Now, it's not clear whether Dorcas was also a widow. Walang mention po dito that Dorcas had a husband. But although some scholars believe na si Dorcas po ay isa ding balo, kaya lang kakaiba lang kay Dorcas, Dorcas was wealthy. Maaring yung kanya, and this is just my imagination. Remember, Joppa is a seaport. A seaport, the usual trabaho, the usual job or business of people in the seaport is actually fishing. Kaya ho madaming widow, usually pala, yung mga fisherman would go to the laot, to the ocean, to the deep sea. If 5 of them would go, because that time the technology is not that good yet, not advanced, maybe isa lang ang makakabalik. Dahil nalunod, or nag-drowned, or whatever. That's why there were so many widows in the seaport area. I can imagine din, naghihintay ka, kalong-kalong mo yung anak mo, no? Inihintay mo ang asawa mo at the shore, and here comes your friend, or yung ka-business partner nila, dahil yung kanilang mga bangka, wala namang motor, kayak lang, or just the sailing kind of boat, and you only see one person instead of 4. Widows were weeping. left by their husbands without nothing or without anything. But praise God for Dorcas. Apparently, Dorcas maybe she was part of that fishing business. The only thing maybe for Dorcas, because where did he get all the money? Where did she get all the resources in sewing? Nung panahon po, mahal ang clothes because handmade. So what Dorcas did, she saw many poor in the church or in the neighborhood. That's her connecting. That's her part of reaching out. She would sew clothes, robes, and garments and would give them. Maybe the widows only have one blouse or skirt. And here comes Dorcas, because she was good in needle, served and impacted this community. If Dorcas is living today, she would get the attention of CNN Heroes of the Year. I have no doubt of it. Ang nakakatawa po, the funeral and the wake turned into a fashion show. Imagine niyo to, I was imagining, ano nangyari? Parating si Peter, where's Dorcas? In the upstairs room. Every time, whenever Peter would pass, the widows were weeping and they were showing their clothes. Ah, Peter, look, everything. I don't know how many widows, but there were many of them, and all of them wore the clothes that Dorcas made for them while she was still alive. Maybe Peter was being hindered going up the stairs. Here comes a widow. Peter, look, Peter. They would not say a word, but they would say, Peter, look. Maybe it was difficult for Peter to get into Dorcas. They were crying and showing robes, other clothing that Dorcas made while she was still alive. I really wonder what an extraordinary heart this woman possessed, that she would impact the poorest of the poor in her own situations. Where did Dorcas get the money? Where did Dorcas get the resources in helping the poor? That's why authors of commentaries are divided when it comes to saying maybe Dorcas was a wealthy, maybe Dorcas owned a fishing business with several, maybe her husband was wealthy, and when her husband died, she started using her resources in impacting people's lives, in serving her community. Imagine an ideology of talking about garments that this woman made. Peter sent them all out dahil ang dami nila. Nag-iiyakan. Peter said, can you please be quiet? I'm just imagining this. They were all crying and they were all showing the robe. Peter said, can you please move out first of the room? Peter sent them all out of the room. Then he got down, he closed the door. Peter got down on his knees and prayed. Now this is different than Aeneas. He saw Aeneas, he just said, Aeneas, Jesus heals you. Now I wonder, remember the story of the little girl that Jesus healed? Peter was there. Talita, get up. He saw how Jesus talked to this little girl and the little girl just stood up. And maybe this is a pattern what Peter did. He saw from Jesus, his master. And maybe he knelt down and he prayed and he said, Lord, what's your will for this woman? Bago ko ipag-pray. Alam mo, ito po ang maganda eh. Hindi kagaya natin na minsan, pag nakakita tayo ng may sakit, no? Paggagalingin ka ni Lord in the name of Jesus. Di ba? Sometimes gano'n eh. Palakasan pa ng boses. Kami ganun po dati. Palakasan ng boses. May pinag-pray po akong bata which really impacted my heart when I was pastoring in Bicol na namatay. I was so devastated. I found myself walking in the middle of the road, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was asking, Lord, bakit? Bakit? Then I've learned along the way, teka anak, may dealing ako eh. May ginagawa ako eh. Ito ikaw, dadating ka, manghihimasok ka, hindi mo alam kung anong nangyayari sa amin eh. Tama eh, no? Ito ako, trying to impress. God has a dealing with I don't know what's His plans eh. And all of a sudden, I'm here just claiming something without really seeking, Lord, what's going on here? What's your will, di ba? Maybe that's what Peter did. He knelt down and he seek God, Lord, Jesus, is it your will for this woman to really leave this world or give her a second chance? I don't know how long it took Peter to pray. Turning towards the dead woman. Now, I was wondering why dead woman? Why not turning towards Dorcas? Just to tell us that really Dorcas died. So that's why it was written this way. Because I was saying, Luke could have written turning towards Dorcas. No eh. the way it was written is, turning towards the dead woman, just to tell us that Dorcas really died. Hindi siya nahimatay o hindi siya natutulog lang o nadismaya. He said, Tabitha, in Hebrew, get up. She opened her eyes and seeing Peter, she sat down. I was imagining ano ang impact nito. Can you imagine? He could hear, Peter could hear the wailing and crying of the widows. I don't know how many widows were outside the room showing all their robes. And all of a sudden, here comes Tabitha or Dorcas being restored to life because maybe Peter heard from God or maybe Peter heard and said, Lord, is this your will before I pray for this woman? And Peter got the confirmation. And in verse 41, he took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. And then he called the believers and the widows and presented Dorcas alive. Amazing, mga kapatid, no? Sa atin parang walang masyadong impact. Pero kung merong isang tao na inaasahan natin sa buhay, maybe he or she is the breadwinner of our family. Imagine yourself in the situations of all the widows. Siya na lang she's the only one that looked after us. And all of a sudden, she passed away. She died. We will again all be miserable. Imagine the impact of Peter presenting Dorcas alive and all the widows seeing Dorcas coming to life. This became known, the great miracle of raising Dorcas from the dead became known all over Joppa, and of course Lydda and all the neighboring cities, and many people believed in the Lord. Wow. Now, hold on to your seats. No? The miracle was widely reported, and because of the miracle, not only because of the miracle, but the testimony of Dorcas, many turned to the Lord, just like the healing of Aeneas. The only difference between Dorcas and Aeneas is that Dorcas, maybe the acts of service of Dorcas was part of it. Then I wrote this in my sermon, nothing influences people more than the power of Christ in the life of a person. Nothing influences our friends than the power of Christ manifesting in our lives. Yung makita po ng ating mga kaibigan, mahal sa buhay, mga magulang, employer, nothing impact their hearts, the lives of people, for them to see the power of Jesus working in our lives. People sees our lives. People sees the work of Jesus in our lives, and it touches them and causes them to turn to God. Dorcas was loved by the church. I was reflecting when I finished my sermon, I was reflecting on Dorcas, and I said, this woman is not like, she's not popular. She doesn't hold the microphone like me. She doesn't sing on the stage beautifully. She doesn't dance with the tambourine. She's not a prophetess that speaks the word and it came to be. She's not even an apostle. She's not even a teacher. She's not popular. She's not fantastic in their ministry. She's not involved in any grand expressions of ministry. But instead, Dorcas was a woman full of good works and service. Maybe she's not good in painting. Maybe she's not good in writing or in the computer. But what made Dorcas really, really inspiring for all of us today, she had a sewing kit. And she made use of that sewing kit. I wonder, what do we have? What do we have? She demonstrated her caring and her service in a very practical way. What an inspiring story for many of us. We don't need to be in the limelight. We don't need to be popular in choosing ministries. What an embarrassment for many Christians today, for many followers of Christ. Sometimes we choose ministry which is more in the limelight. When we try to choose for involvement in the church, but little did we realize that serving the Lord is not in the position that we are in. What do you think God has given you, skilled you to do? We can make a difference pala. We can make an impact. Ministry involves more than distributing clothing in the case of Dorcas. But Dorcas served truly with the love that she had. Her distribution of clothes, hindi huminasama ng mga tao. Di ba? Kasi minsan ngayong panahon, when you give away your clothes, baka masama pa ang dating eh. Or maybe in the way we pass our clothes. But for Dorcas, it was a welcome because she was sewing them and giving them to the widows, taking care of them. Her simple concern for others, rather than the powerful speaking or a great singing voice, won Dorcas the love of her friends and her neighbors. Even to the point of sending 2 men to fetch Peter. Because for them, Dorcas was a very important person. Look at the reward. Serving others wins a great reward. People doesn't want you to die. Diba? Yung ayaw kang mamatay ng mga kaibigan mo. May mga kaibigan na, sige, mamatay na nga yan. Can you imagine the impact ng, ano kaya ang feeling ng, ano kaya ang sinasabi ng mga kaibigan mo? Gusto ka na bang mamatay? Or gusto ka nilang pag namatay ka talagang yuyugyugin nila ang langit para buhayin ka lang ng Diyos? That's what happened to Dorcas. They bothered heaven. They sent people to fetch Peter. People loved her, missed her. Sometimes our desire for more of a public ministry, like preaching, singing, teaching. Sometimes our desire for more of a public ministry, we forget that the greatest servant in the kingdom of God are people who serve without being noticed. So what's our take home today? Serving others wins a great reward. Not only in the eyes of people, but in the very eyes of God. The grading system ni God, hindi dahil kung ano ang ginagawa natin, but how are we doing it? How faithful we are in doing it. Diba God said, the principle of Jesus is that when we are trusted in small things, God would reward us or entrust us with bigger things. Hindi pala sa kung ano ang ginagawa natin sa ministry. Hindi ho dahil kami ay preacher, kami yung nagtuturo ng salita ng Diyos. Hindi dahil kami nasa taas, kami yung may mas malaking reward. No, the grading system is not in what we are doing, but in how faithful we are before God who called us to do this. So Dorcas, it didn't bother her. Maybe Dorcas said, I'm not good in speaking, I'm not good in preaching, I'm not good in singing, I'm not good in dancing, but God gave me the gift of sewing. And I really enjoy. Now that we know this, now that we know that serving others wins a great reward, now what is it to us? What do we do now, Pastor Butch? I only have one suggestion for all of us. Let us serve God with what He has given us. Serve God with what He has given you. And you will feel the joy of doing it. It's no longer a burden because that's what God has given you. That even people don't notice you, you continue in doing it because there's joy, because you know that this is what God has given me. This is how I can impact and serve other people. Stop desiring and thinking of what you don't have. Start focusing on what God or what we have. Tandaan natin, sa kakarian ng Diyos, ang tinitingnan ng Panginoon is ang puso natin na tapat na gumagawa ng maliit na bagay o malaking bagay man ang ipinagkatiwala sa atin.